Hey guys, this is Ukradowski of WeAreChange.org here off the coast of Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. Now, as you probably know, Mexico has been in the news a lot lately, especially with Donald Trump announcing that he will designate drug dealers here as a terrorist organization. Now, this will have major ramifications on not only U.S.-Mexico relations, but of course, major effects on life here, with even talk of military intervention by the United States being an option. And that's why in this particular video, I wanted to talk about the root cause and the underlying issues that are not talked about when it comes to Mexico. And of course, the US mainstream media that usually just focuses on a lot of fear mongering. Now, even coming down here, one of my friends who was supposed to join me freaked out. It was terrified because of a lot of the fear mongering. Now, there's a lot of important issues to get into, especially in the uptick of violence, which we will be talking about at the end of the video, as well as this supposed gentleman's code, which is going to be an important topic that we're going to be getting into. But a lot of what's being proposed right now is, of course, more government, more direct intervention from the United States to fix this supposed problem. And I think it's important to highlight previous attempts by the US government to address this supposed problem. Now, this is important to me because if you just do a little bit of homework, a little bit of research, you have found out that every time the government, especially the US government, when it comes to this larger war on drugs, every time they get involved, the situation becomes disastrous. People also need to be reminded that one of the largest drug organizations here in Mexico, known as the Zetas, that broke this gentleman's agreement, which we'll get into in just a little bit. This very powerful organization came from directly after Mexican troops were trained in the 1990s by American Special Forces known as the Snake Eaters at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. Again, the largest, most sinister, some would even say the most dangerous organization of drug dealers here was directly trained and assisted by U.S. Special Forces known as the Snake Eaters, professional killers. Then when these elite Mexican police officers came back to Mexico after being trained in the United States, they essentially said, why should I work for the gang that is calling themselves government that is corrupt? There are a lot of corrupt elements here, but I could just create my own gang. And that's what they did after being trained by the most powerful mercenaries. And they took that knowledge, they took that information, that special skill that they learned from the US government to address this problem, and became career contract killers and drug dealers in an efficient way that Mexico hasn't seen before. Also, breaking, of course, the gentleman's code, which was a specific unwritten code of laws here that prevented minors, prevented women, prevented innocent bystanders from being victims of the larger conflicts that happened between different organizations vying for power and the opportunity to sell people's drugs. And when you look at the history of the Zetas, I mean, holy cow, they bring the TV series Walking Life to reality. Some of the things that they did are too gruesome to even talk about here, but they would use propaganda films of the worst, I can't even describe. I mean, just doing the research on this, I just felt absolutely sick. But they would film torture. They would take their rivals' heads and put it on spikes. And they broke the gentleman code, which is still operating somewhat on some level here in southern Mexico. In northern Mexico, when you get closer to the US border, when you get more competition for the big drug market, for America's big thirst for drugs, this is where you see a lot of the violence. Another time that the U.S. government decided to get involved to deal with this situation, not only helping create the worst, atrocious gang of them all, but another time was under Barack Obama, who, with the federal government, decided to launch Fast and Furious, a program that sent machine guns and high capacity assault rifles, whatever you may call assault rifles, and military hardware, guns, down to Mexico in order to track who's using them. And when the public found out about this, it just bewildered a bunch of people to why? Why would the U.S. government, under Barack Obama, this is not widely talked about other than conservative circles, but this is an important aspect to understand what's happening here. Under Fast and Furious, Barack Obama shipped a ton of weapons down here, some of them that have been used against U.S. personnel, some of them that have killed U.S. personnel. And of course, that's not a big topic of discussion, but it should be. Now, when you look at some of the biggest kind of drug dealers in history, the third aspect that is really worth considering here, we of course think of Pablo Escobar, who, by the way, was worth $25 billion, a wealth all gathered through illicit means. But this is really what is worth considering here. How can one man become so powerful? Well, according to Pablo Escobar's son, who has recently come out, it was because Pablo Escobar had relations and worked with the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, even going as far as to saying that they were essentially his partners in business. Yes. Now we look at also the case of El Chapo that happened here. He was worth $1 billion. Still significant, not as significant as El Chapo. And there was also many talks of just his complicity in working with U.S. intelligence agencies, which again is very, very possible here, because how many times does the Central Intelligence Agency need to be caught with large shipments of cocaine? And we know that from the story of Freeway Ricky Ross, the Iran-Contra scandal, where the U.S. CIA, U.S. intelligence were working with and cooperating with drug dealers, shipping in cocaine, establishing crack cocaine in the streets of the United States in order to support their guerrilla movement against a government that wasn't favorable towards U.S. interests. There's actually a pretty popular meme that I just saw a couple of moments ago where it says, it has Donald Trump standing there and says, building a wall will stop drug traffickers. And then underneath him is a guy with a CIA logo on his face saying, not so sure about that. Because it's been documented time and time again that this unaccountable government agency works with, cooperates with, and establishes some of the bigger atrocities, some of the bigger misdoings in this world. And we have to understand, unless we address that problem, unless there's some actual accountability for that problem, this problem is only going to continue no matter what you designate an organization from, and whether what the United States did with Fast and Furious, what the United States did with the Zetas was done by accident or on purpose. It once again shows you that the more that you try to deal with this problem, the more they just make it worse. Now we could go into different evidence that suggests either side of this particular argument, but what's important here is that anything will be ineffective when it comes to prohibition, which is absolutely idiotic, which is absolutely stupid. If you look at what happened in the United States with alcohol prohibition, which, by the way, was pushed on by David Rockefeller and his interest in oil, also making it illegal for people to create biodiesel, ethanol, and fuel out of alcohol. This is why one of the reasons David Rockefeller pushed and supported and financed prohibition in the United States in the early 1900s. Also where the government was caught poisoning illicit alcohol, killing American citizens to make sure that they would stop drinking alcohol. When you look at prohibition in the United States against alcohol, what did it do? It spurred the most vicious crime spree that cities have seen. It made mafiosos rise to prominence and enabled them to be way more powerful than, of course, many police departments, many governments. All of this, why? Well, it absolutely makes no sense at all, because my body, my choice, right? Well, no. There's a big interest of drugs. There's a big interest on hooking people on drugs, which, by the way, the pharma industrial complex does in an extremely efficient way, creating, of course, the opioid crisis, bringing in tons of Americans onto the streets to ask for heroin after they take them off their legal heroin. The whole argument of prohibition absolutely makes no sense at all. Now, the president of Mexico has been in power for 1 year. He already took great steps towards decriminalizing marijuana. There's even a judge that recently ruled in Mexico City that 2 individuals may use recreational cocaine. Now, you automatically might think all drugs are legalized. This kind of illicit drug trafficking business is going to rise, and that's absolutely not true. You look at the success stories of places in Holland, of places in Portugal with their decriminalization efforts, with their efforts, instead of jailing people, making money off them, throwing them into private prison industries, making them worse criminals than they started off to be, teaching them pretty much an education camp for criminals. That's a big business for a bunch of people. That's oddly called rehabilitation, but it oddly creates worse criminals. When you have a situation like that unfolding, you really have to scratch your head and ask yourself, what is going on here? Because it absolutely makes no sense at all. And when it comes to what's happening in Mexico, once you make this more of an illicit business, once you put more pressure on it, the nastier, the uglier we'll get, because people's appetites will only increase for those illegal substances. Psychologically, this has been proven many times. And until America figures out their problem with consuming drugs, which is the main reason why there's so many drug dealers here and such a big booming drug business, until America figures that out, this problem won't go away. And this is why, in my opinion, decriminalization is just a common sense answer here. And it makes more sense than a military intervention, than making this business darker, more secret, more shadowy, more dark than it already is. Let me know if you think I'm wrong. I would love to hear any counter discussions and counter arguments as I walk through the Mexican jungle right now. Also, it's important to note here that a lot of the bigger drug organizations here have already stopped producing marijuana that used to cross the border. Why? Because states legalized it. There has been a huge boom of heroin, and that's mainly because of the opioid crisis that is being fueled by doctors, by the media, by the government, that allowed it to thrive like it has. But it's yet another example of how decriminalization just makes absolute sense. That's my take on it. Love to hear your feedback. I hope you appreciated this little random video of me checking out Mexico. Again, just like any part of the world, if you know the local area, if you know the local community, if you know people, you're fine. You know, there's parts of Brownsville, Brooklyn, or probably Chicago that are a lot worse than, of course, here in Mexico. But again, it's all about just having the right information and knowledge. I hope we were able to spark some of this bigger debate, some of this bigger understanding with this conversation that's happening around Mexico right now, because it is a very, very important one. If you thought so, share this video. If you want to support this independent media organization that talks about these issues that are outside of the mainstream media control grid, fear-mongering narrative, support us. You can support us by even purchasing a t-shirt that says demonetized, or even a hat that says Jeffrey Epstein didn't kill himself on the Teespring store. We're doing a sale. All the information will be in the description below. And with your purchases, you help support independent media. And because you guys do, this is why I say, love you guys. Stay tuned for more here on wearechange.org.